Liz Ortiz spoke to one former Maryland senator today about the fate of that statue and what could be replacing it.
This was the moment when the Christopher Columbus statue in Little Italy was torn down by protesters last weekend. A group can be seen dragging it on the ground towards the harbor and throwing the statue into the water. Earlier this week, Little Italy residents, including former state senator John Pica, worked together to try and recover pieces of the statue. Ultimately, it took this heavy-duty tow truck to pull it out. But now that it is out, what's next for the Columbus statue?
We are restoring the Columbus statue. We're not sure where that's going to go yet.
Pica says the Italian-American community has been in touch with Councilman Zeke Cohen, who represents Little Italy.
I believe the focal point of that park will remain a tribute to an Italian figure. We don't know who it is.
On Thursday, Mayor Jack Young condemned the action of the protesters.
There's no way you can, erase history. You learn from it. And those monuments should have something there to talk about what happened in the dark past.
There are still 2 other monuments dedicated to Columbus in the city. Many are hoping they will be addressed and possibly even taken down by city leadership. In 2016, a special commission was formed to review Baltimore's public Confederate monuments before they were removed. But when asked if there's any talk of forming a similar commission to address the Columbus monuments, Mayor Young said this.
I would defer to the next administration.
Baltimore's likely next mayor, City Council President Brandon Scott, has not exactly said what his plan would be. There will be an upcoming City Council hearing to discuss what to do with the Columbus Monument in Herring Run Park in Baltimore. Liz Ortiz, Fox 45 News.
Well, so far, no one has been charged in connection with that incident. Police responded to our inquiries today, saying simply the incident is under investigation.
Christopher Columbus changed the course of history. He is a man to be celebrated. He was not perfect. No man is perfect.
We will not continue to tolerate people like Columbus being idolized.
We support peaceful protests. This is not a peaceful protest. There's no way you can erase history.
To me, it's an insult to everybody who wears a uniform, whether you're a cop, a fireman, or a military person.
It's just not a memorial. It's something that's dear to our heart.
This is just wholly disrespectful to the families. Everyone with common sense can read in between the lines.
From Fox 45 in Baltimore, this is a Your Voice, Your Future town hall. A monumental discussion.
Good evening, I'm Kai Jackson. Thank you for joining us online. In the midst of a global pandemic, a national protest against racial injustice is sweeping from sea to shining sea. A monumental part of the discussion involves who, we as a country, literally put up on a pedestal. Well, time changes perspectives and values. Now, in the midst of a protest, Christopher Columbus, Confederate generals, and Supreme Court justice monuments are under fire. But who decides who stays and who goes? And what's the proper procedure to remove these symbols? A group identifying themselves as protesters ripped the Christopher Columbus monument from its pedal in Little Italy in Baltimore. They carried this symbol of pride in the Italian community to the Baltimore waterfront and promptly tossed it into the water. Now, this act of vandalism and destruction of public property was watched by local police. Some argue this violent action is akin to the Boston Tea Party. Lots of opinions, lots of disagreement. But our goal tonight is to facilitate, in a civil way, a public discussion and conversation on this important issue. So we've assembled a panel, a diverse panel, in fact, to share their thoughts and opinions. Joining us tonight is Maryland State Delegate Nino Mangione. He introduced a bill in the Maryland legislature to protect monuments. Baynard Woods is an author and freelance writer. He has a book coming out next week on Baltimore's corrupt gun trace task force. Dr. Richard Vatz is a professor of rhetoric and communication at Towson University. Dr. Jason Nichols is a senior lecturer in the African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland. David Marshall Wright is a candidate for the 3rd District City Council seat. His opponent, current Councilman Ryan Dorsey, called for the removal of the police memorial. Now, we should point out, Fox 45 did invite Councilman Dorsey to attend tonight. He did not respond to our invitation. Dr. Kate Drabinski is professor of gender and women's studies at UMBC. And author and professor of communications at Stevenson University, Dr. Heather Harris, joins us as well. Guests, thank you all for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. Well, first of all, I'm going to lay out one quick ground rule, and that is please give us answers as tersely, as briefly as you possibly can. My goal is to get back to each of you as much as I possibly can tonight to facilitate our discussion. But let's start our discussion tonight with Delegate Nino Mangione. Delegate Mangione, you've spoken out about the destruction of the Columbus Monument. That was probably the most visible thing that's happened recently about this. Talk to us about what happened that night, which was on the 4th of July, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, thank you, Kai. And I just want to make two quick points. Number one, that law-abiding Marylanders, we're not going to cede the future of our state or our country to those who want to destroy America. Number two, you mentioned they compared them to the Boston Tea Party. I don't believe these people are protesters. I don't think they're patriots. They're not social justice warriors that they claim to be. What they are and what we saw was a lawless mob hell-bent on destruction of property. And I can tell you, any politician, because that goes into it, that tolerates this behavior is just as bad as they are. We saw it. We all saw what happened. They destroyed this iconic Columbus statue that meant a lot to the Italian-American community, and it was complete lawlessness, and it cannot and should not be allowed to happen.
Quickly, Delegate Mangione, with respect to the Italian community, for instance, Brandon Scott, the city council president, who very well could be the next mayor, providing the election bear out that way in the fall, says he supports the Italian community in Baltimore, but he does not support Columbus, as many Native Americans don't, and as many descendants of slaves in this country don't, because of Columbus's trek across the globe and what happened after he got here.
Kai, we can have that discussion any day of the week, but we all have to agree, especially as elected officials, that lawlessness, like we saw the other day, cannot be allowed to stand. I wrote a letter to the mayor, and that falls on the front of the city council as well. Brandon Scott, about to be the next mayor, to protect this, even to the governor, to protect these statues. We all have to agree, and I have not seen a condemnation of the mob from a lot of elected officials in Baltimore City who failed in their job to protect that property.
All right, Delegate Mangione, thank you. Professor Jason Nichols has an opposing viewpoint. Professor Nichols, we'd like you to join in the conversation right now. What do you think of what Delegate Mangione said?
Well, I agree with him that there are ways and processes that we can go through in order to remove some of these symbols that we don't agree with or don't align with our values anymore. So I would agree with him on that in that respect. However, I think that what you said about the descendants of enslaved people and the indigenous people, what we want in our monuments is something that shows the values that we aspire to and what we want to be in the future. And when people look at Columbus, they don't actually see that. I don't think we should destroy these statues. We should put them in their proper context. Talk about some of what they may have done correctly and the laundry list of things that they did wrong, and put them where they belong, in a museum where students and others can come and visit and talk about it. But actually having it out on display, it sends the wrong message about who we are as a people. And certainly in a city that is 65% Black, it certainly doesn't send a very good message about what we believe about our own people and how we respect them. So I think, moving this into its proper context and the proper place, which would probably be a museum, makes perfect sense to me.
And talk to me quickly about your book coming out.
My book?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was Mr. Woods. I'm sorry. My apologies. I got ahead of myself.
No
My apologies. I also want to bring in Dr. Kate Drabinski. Dr. Drabinski, what are your thoughts on this conversation we're having about monuments and memorials, not just in Baltimore, but across the country?
So I'm struck immediately by the language that Delegate Mangione opens with, this call to have a civil conversation. And what struck me specifically is when he said, we all saw what happened. And that's the thing that I think a lot of us are missing in these discussions, is that there isn't a we that just sees what happens, right? So some people saw people rising up, refusing this celebration of sort of a symbol of colonialism, and saw people, just Baltimoreans, ripping that down and saying no, right? what Delegate Mangione saw was a serious violence, right? So we're seeing different things. And the call to have a civil conversation and a civil way of taking these monuments down, I think, misses the part where there often has to be a violent push to challenge the people like the delegate who generally get to set the terms for how these conversations happen. I will say that since those people tore down that statue, I've had a lot more conversations about what colonization has meant, what settler colonialism means, and the way that that celebration continues to shape our lives than I ever heard when we just had the statue there.
Dr. Drabinski, is there a better way to address the statues other than just ripping them off their pedestals?
You know, I don't know. I'm just one person, and these need to be collective conversations. I will say, doing something that I rarely do, look back at our founding fathers, and I think that whole concept is really problematic. But one thing that George Washington said is that we shouldn't have statues to individual people in a democracy. That's not what democracies are about. They're not about lionizing a single person, right? That we need to have collective conversations. And if the space isn't there for the collective conversation, which hasn't been, sometimes it takes violence to make that space. So I'm not going to tell you what we should do, but I will tell you that I'm excited to see so many people talking about what historical memory means and how it shapes our reality.
And we appreciate your candor with that. That's a pretty bold statement you make, but you're being very candid, and we do appreciate that. Quickly, Delegate Mangione, you do have a bill. Have you introduced that bill already into the House of Delegates?
Thank you. I did. I pre-filed, and I have to say that was one heck of a justification for a mob to tear down something that doesn't belong to them. It's basically her way of saying it's fine, it's okay. They can destroy private, public property, and where does it end? Maybe it ends at my store or my house if they don't like me. I mean, this is lawlessness. That's what we saw. Anybody that saw the video saw a group, a mob, tear down something that doesn't belong to them. It is against the law. But since it's not going to be enforced, I want to put some teeth into a bill where I introduced the Monument Protection Act that will basically make it mandatory to go after the lawlessness. And I, as an elected official, she's right, I can't sit by any longer, at least not attempt to make an effort to put an end to the lawlessness. I appreciate the professor before, because it's not about Columbus. It's really about the lawlessness and what we saw happen.
Delegate Mangione, before we're going to see a story from Jeff Abel. Before we do, is mob, and I'm not trying to second guess you, is mob the term you want to use? Mobs lynched black Americans in this country from its very founding. Is that the term you want to use? That's what I think of when I think of a mob, people who actually lynched people around the country, which happened quite a bit, some whites, but predominantly African Americans. Is that the correct term for the group, even though they may have been lawless?
Well, Kai, I think when people think of mobs in today's society, they think of a large group of people. I can call them Antifa-like thugs if you want. I mean, I can call them, I would call it the mafia, Italian Americans. They were thugs, they were a mob. I mean, it's nothing to do with race here, because I would talk very harshly about the mafia that made the Italian Americans look horrible. They were a mob, they were thugs. So I don't think most people look at it like that, and I certainly don't mean to imply that. It's a large group of people.
Sure.
That's what I'm referring to.
I just wanted to ask you. Okay, and quickly before we do that, I want to bring in Dr. Heather Harris really quickly. Dr. Harris, what are your thoughts about? Okay, we'll get back to Dr. Harris in a minute. Let's listen in to the story from Fox 45's Jeff Abel about the Christopher Columbus statue.
When it comes to the city's police memorial, which honors dozens of fallen police officers, the suggestion that the memorial should be removed has drawn fire from political leaders to the families of the fallen.
I don't think that people realize how the other side feels and how they would feel if their loved ones were disgraced as they're disgracing our loved ones.
Today, City Councilman Ryan Dorsey attempted to clarify his comments with a tweet, writing, "At no time did I call for the removal of the city's memorials to police officers, and I'm not now calling for that. My original comment was a question inviting debate and nothing more, and I've been clear that I was motivated by my critique of the conduct of the FOP." But that's not exactly what Dorsey wrote in his earlier tweet, saying, How is it that with all the attention given to the Columbus monuments and as consistently awful as the FOP is, how is the FOP Memorial not on the list of monuments to remove?
What he said was pretty clear to anyone who read it, and several people have called him out on it, and he could just apologize.
In an interview this afternoon, former police officer and police spokesman T.J. Smith called the comment disrespectful, and the governor called Dorsey's comments vile, saying in a statement that he is disgusted by Dorsey's vile remarks about the public memorial.
This is just wholly disrespectful to the families. I would challenge Mr. Dorsey to go out and have a conversation with the widow of a fallen officer or family member. Everyone with common sense can read in between the lines.
Dorsey's opponent in the upcoming general election, David Marshall Wright, is also taking aim, writing today, "We need leaders who are going to pursue policies to reform the department, not ones who are creating more divisiveness."